all over the colonial world, then a virus was spreading as colonial authorities found themselves as occupiers and not liberators, engaged in confrontations and war that was so unconventional. It was not what the military authorities had been trained to practice. This gives us a new twist on total war with three features to them. The first is that these armies become occupying armies. That is, struggling to control territories as well as peoples who are rising up against them. The second, that in order to justify these kinds of practices that had to be used to contain civilian populations, was that the colonial peoples were increasingly dehumanized. They became, as it were, the other, cast in a role in this drama as necessarily inferior, irremediably hopeless, and therefore deserving of the fate that was being meted out on them. And the third was the sheer asymmetry of power. What von Trotta could wield over the Herreros was staggering, and the Herreros had little to use other than what their communities could produce to sustain them to wage this kind of confrontation. And yet, we get a paradox that once colonial armies were in and sucked into this pattern of confrontation, it was very hard to get out. These are wars that are very difficult to extricate yourself from, as I might add, President Obama has been discovering in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, this instability that I've been describing was not just a feature of the colonial world, it also spread to the non-colonial world. This was a period of distemper that brought regimes, some of them ancient, venerable regimes, to face inner turmoil and intensified external pressures. Dynasties were increasingly in trouble. And we begin to see the dawn of a new cycle of revolutions, a new age of revolutions that, in a sense, was an echo of the age of revolutions that we talked about in an earlier lecture of the late 18th and early 19th century periods of the American, French, and Latin American revolutions. In this round, it will culminate in 1917 in Russia, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a future lecture. But what we need to know now is the tensions and the conflicts that are spreading in the first years of the 20th century already begin to hobble some of the ancien regimes before the First World War begins. Russia was caught up in a series of rivalries, as you now know, because you've been paying a lot of attention to these lectures, rivalries with Japan in the Pacific, with the British in Central Asia, and increasingly in the theater of Eastern Europe with emerging powers like Germany. After the humiliation of the war with Japan in the 1890s, that upstart state, the Tsarist regime was faced by rising fiscal troubles, growing domestic inequities, and the feature that we've talked about in earlier lectures, a wave of strikes and protests against the Tsarist regime and demands for reforms. All of this culminates in a call for sweeping constitutional changes to put constraints on the power of the Tsar himself. That first big upheaval in demand for a new constitutional system occurs in 1905. And I've put on the screen here an image of what's called Bloody Sunday, an episode in which the Tsarist troops responded to the demands for intensified reform and limits on his power with repression. Note, by the way, a return to the cycle we've referred to earlier of rising inter-imperial rivalry, growing pressures from reform as a result of the pressures that are being placed on societies to sustain states that are locked in these rivalries. In East Asia, Central Asia, all the way through Europe, we see a similar round intensifying, culminating in this revolt and its repression. Now, the Tsar, in the end, did agree to some reforms. The State Duma of the Russian Empire was created, a multi-party system was rolled out, and finally a new constitution was unveiled in 1906. And so we see yet another stage in the cycle that we've been describing, where reforms are issued in the wake of protests to prevent further backsliding. We might say that this is part of what we see happening in the Islamic world nowadays. In this particular case, the architect of the reforms was a man called Peter Stolypin. But it was, in a long tradition of efforts of reform, a case of perhaps too little, too late, in spite of the efforts of Stolypin to begin to shake up the Russian Empire, reminding us, in some senses, of a paradox of reform, that one conducts reforms very often when one has the most incentive to do it, to dissolve a crisis, and yet because one is in a crisis, one has the least room or the least resources to be able to carry out these reforms. Again, we're going to see this over and over again. Now, the Russian regime was not the only dynasty in trouble. Turkey, too, was having troubles at home. The late 19th century saw a new generation of reformers, not unlike those we see emerging in Russia. In this case, they were called the Young Turks, who wanted to transform what they perceived as a decrepit, stagnant Ottoman Empire into a modern nation state. They championed a constitution of 1908, and this new effort to impose a constitutional system in the Ottoman Empire provoked a round of tension and reprisals. Monarchists disliked the controls that were being posed on the Sultan. Armenian minorities, in fact many minorities, began to demand new rights under this new constitutional system implemented in 1908. They wanted their freedoms as well. And of course, monarchists then accused the reformers and the Young Turks of beginning to dismantle a system and giving freedoms to these upstart minorities. The government charged the minority Christian Armenians as being secessionist and anti-Turkish, and began to fan the flames of sectarianism and nationalist identity against minority populations. We will begin to see atrocities then being perpetrated in the Ottoman Empire as the army and even civilians were used to put down and repress Armenian Christians. In Adana, in 1909, this is an image, we're going to see, I warned you, a lot of images of hanged people. Civilians who were accused of treason against the Sultan now being hanged. Ethnic unrest spread across the Caucasus. Armenian massacres became widespread by 1909, especially focused on the Adana province. And the government issued a series of pogroms that left up to 30,000 people dead from this one province alone. This would, of course, pave the way for a much more systematic pattern of genocide during the First World War. This, of course, this specter of this kind of atrocity got picked up in the popular press. This is a French magazine portraying the Adana massacres back to France. And it would begin to shape international public opinion against the Ottoman Empire. We will even see the emergence of a new vocabulary to describe these kinds of episodes. Here we see a pamphlet to denounce the Turkish atrocities conducted by young Turks, issuing then a catalog of truths about, and here we see the term used, the Holocaust at Adana in 1909. So we see then a new humanitarian crusade emerging in the late 19th and early 20th century against these kinds of atrocities being meted out by states. What will eventually become called, in our vocabulary, a human rights movement. Growing out of the ability on the part of journalists, photojournalists, investigators, photographers, and writers who tap into people's ability to empathize with other peoples. Again, a process that we've been describing over this course. So let's pause here to consider the comparative challenges the two old empires were facing, two old regimes facing in the turn of the century, the Russian and the Ottoman empires.